Have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to become your second family? Have you ever stood in a courtroom, your reputation on the line, while everyone you thought loved you watched with judgment in their eyes? Let me tell you about the day my in-laws dragged me to court in the most public, humiliating way possible, and how one single receipt turned their entire case upside down. My name isn't important, but my story is, because it's about trust, betrayal, money, and the moment when truth finally wins against lies. I never imagined that saying I do would eventually lead me to a judge's bench, fighting for my dignity, my marriage, and my future. But here I am, ready to share every painful, shocking detail of what happened to me. Because maybe, just maybe, my story will help someone else who's going through something similar. It all started on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, but looking back now, I can see the cracks forming even then, the subtle signs I ignored because I was too in love, too hopeful, too naive to see what was really happening behind those forced smiles and cold embraces. I remember the first time I met Marcus's parents like it was yesterday, even though it was over 3 years ago now. We had been dating for about 6 months, and I was absolutely head over heels for this man who seemed to understand me in ways nobody ever had before. Marcus was kind, thoughtful, ambitious, and he made me laugh until my sides hurt. When he finally invited me to meet his family at their large estate just outside the city, I was nervous but excited, believing that if they were anything like their son, we would get along wonderfully. I spent hours choosing the perfect outfit, something that said I was respectful but confident, classy but approachable. I bought expensive wine and fresh flowers, wanting to make the best possible first impression. Marcus kept reassuring me during the drive, squeezing my hand and telling me they would love me just as much as he did. But the moment we pulled up to that massive iron gate and drove down the tree-lined driveway to the sprawling mansion, I felt something shift in my stomach, a nervous energy I couldn't quite name. The house was intimidating, all marble and crystal chandeliers, perfectly manicured gardens, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. When his mother, Patricia, opened the door, she looked me up and down with eyes that seemed to calculate my worth in seconds. Her smile didn't reach those cold blue eyes, and when she took the flowers from my hands, she passed them immediately to a housekeeper without even glancing at them. His father, Richard, was equally formal, shaking my hand with a grip that felt more like a test of strength than a greeting. During that first dinner, I noticed how they spoke around me rather than to me, discussing family matters and business dealings as if I were invisible, occasionally glancing my way as if remembering I was there, and offering a tight smile before continuing their conversation. I tried to engage, asking questions about their business, complimenting the beautiful home, sharing stories about my own family and my work as a nurse. But every attempt felt like it hit a wall of polite indifference. Marcus seemed oblivious to the tension, or maybe he was just so used to his parents' behavior that he didn't notice how uncomfortable they made me feel. His younger sister, Caroline, was the only one who showed any genuine warmth, though even she seemed careful about being too friendly in front of her parents. That night, as we drove back to the city, I tried to express my concerns to Marcus, but he laughed it off, telling me his parents were just protective and formal with new people, that they would warm up once they got to know me better. I wanted to believe him so badly that I pushed my instincts aside and told myself I was being oversensitive, that not every family was as openly affectionate as mine, that I just needed to give them time. Over the next several months, I did exactly that, attending every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every charity event they invited us to, always bringing thoughtful gifts, always dressing appropriately, always minding my manners and trying to find common ground. But no matter what I did, Patricia remained distant and critical, making subtle comments about my background, my education, my career choice, comparing me unfavorably to the daughters of their wealthy friends, women who came from the right families and went to the right schools. Richard was less openly hostile, but somehow even more intimidating, watching me with those calculating eyes, as if waiting for me to make a mistake that would prove I wasn't good enough for his son. I started to dread these family gatherings, feeling like I was constantly being evaluated and found wanting. But I loved Marcus so much that I endured it, believing that eventually they would see what he saw in me. When Marcus proposed to me on a beautiful evening overlooking the harbor, with the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down my face as he slipped that ring onto my finger. In that moment, all the awkwardness with his family seemed like a small price to pay for a lifetime with the man I loved. We called our families immediately, and while my parents screamed with joy and started planning to fly in to celebrate, Marcus's parents offered congratulations that sounded more like a business transaction than excitement about their son's happiness. Patricia's first question was about the size of the diamond, and Richard wanted to know if I had signed a prenuptial agreement yet. I felt my joy deflate slightly, but Marcus squeezed my hand and whispered that they were just being practical, that they had always been this way about everything. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the proposal in my mind, I pushed away the nagging feeling that this marriage was going to be more complicated than I had imagined. I told myself that love conquers all, that Marcus and I were strong enough to handle whatever challenges came our way, that eventually his parents would see how much we cared for each other and accept me as part of the family. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was, how I mistook their cold tolerance for acceptance, how I ignored every red flag because I was so desperate to believe in the fairy tale. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you convinced yourself to overlook the obvious warning signs? Have you ever loved someone so much that you were willing to accept mistreatment from their family just to keep the peace? Comment below if you've ever been in a situation where you felt like you had to prove your worth to your partner's family, because what happened next would test every ounce of strength I had. The wedding planning process revealed just how deep the issues with my in-laws ran, though I still didn't fully comprehend the extent of their hostility toward me. Patricia insisted on being involved in every single decision, from the venue to the flowers to the menu, and she had opinions about everything, most of them designed to make me feel inadequate, or to subtly communicate that my taste wasn't refined enough for their family. When I chose a beautiful but reasonably priced venue that could accommodate all our guests, she suggested several alternative locations that cost 3 times as much, making pointed comments about how important it was for the wedding to reflect the family's status in the community. When I selected my bridesmaids' dresses in a soft blush color that complemented my wedding gown, she wondered aloud whether something more traditional wouldn't be more appropriate, implying that my choice was somehow tacky or unconventional. She questioned my decision to have my cousin as my maid of honor instead of Caroline, even though Caroline and I barely knew each other and my cousin had been my best friend since childhood. She criticized my choice of a local photographer instead of the expensive society photographer all her friends used. She even had issues with my wedding dress, which I had found at a boutique and absolutely loved, suggesting that perhaps I should consider something from a more prestigious designer, something that would photograph better, something more befitting a bride marrying into their family. Every planning session left me feeling exhausted and inadequate, wondering why nothing I chose was ever good enough, questioning my own judgment and taste. Marcus tried to mediate, but he was often traveling for work, and I didn't want to burden him with every small battle with his mother, so I kept most of my frustration to myself, compromising on things that mattered to me just to keep the peace. My own mother, who had flown in several times to help with planning, could see how stressed I was, and gently suggested that maybe Patricia's involvement was causing more harm than good, but I insisted that it was important to include her, that she was Marcus's mother and deserved to have input on her son's wedding. What I didn't realize then was that Patricia wasn't trying to help plan a beautiful wedding. She was trying to maintain control, to remind me at every turn that I was marrying into their world and would need to live by their rules. The actual wedding day was a blur of emotions, beautiful and stressful in equal measure. I felt gorgeous in my dress as my father walked me down the aisle, and when I saw Marcus waiting for me at the altar with tears in his eyes, everything else faded away for a moment. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves, promising to love and support each other through everything life threw at us. And when we kissed as husband and wife, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The reception was held at the expensive venue Patricia had pushed for, and I had to admit it was stunning, with crystal chandeliers and fresh flowers everywhere and a band that kept everyone dancing. But throughout the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, evaluated, judged. Patricia spent most of the reception networking with her society friends, barely spending any time with me or even seeming happy about the occasion. Richard gave a toast that was more about Marcus's accomplishments and the family legacy than about our love or our future together. Several of their friends made comments to me about how lucky I was to marry into such an established family, as if Marcus hadn't also been lucky to find me, as if my value was only in relation to his family's wealth and status. The honeymoon was the only respite I got from the tension with Marcus's family. 2 blissful weeks in Italy where we could just be ourselves, exploring ancient cities, eating incredible food, making love under the Mediterranean sun, and dreaming about our future together. We talked about having children someday, about the home we would build together, about careers and travel and all the adventures that awaited us. For those 2 weeks, I felt like everything was going to be okay, that our love was strong enough to weather any storm, that we could handle whatever challenges his family threw at us. But the moment we returned home and reality set back in, I felt the walls closing in again. We had decided to live in the city, in a modest apartment that we could afford on our 2 salaries. But Patricia had other ideas, suggesting we move into one of the properties Richard owned, a much larger place in a prestigious neighborhood that would be more appropriate for Marcus's position at the family company. When we politely declined, explaining that we wanted to build our life together independently, I saw something dark flash across her face, a look that sent chills down my spine. It was the first time I realized that this wasn't just about her being overprotective or having difficulty letting go of her son. This was about control, about keeping Marcus tied to the family in every possible way, and I was threatening that control simply by existing. Richard was more direct, calling Marcus into his office and suggesting that perhaps I didn't understand the opportunities and security that came with being part of their family, implying that I was being selfish or stubborn by wanting us to maintain some independence. Marcus defended our decision, but I could see the strain it put on him, torn between his loyalty to his family and his commitment to our marriage, trying to balance everyone's expectations while building our new life together. The first year of our marriage was harder than I ever imagined it could be, not because of problems between Marcus and me, but because of the constant pressure and interference from his family. Patricia called multiple times a day, always with some request or criticism or piece of unsolicited advice about how we should be running our household, managing our money, planning our future. Richard offered Marcus promotions and opportunities at the family company that always seemed to come with strings attached, expectations that we would move closer to them, that we would spend more time at family events, that I would quit my job and focus on being a proper wife and future mother to their grandchildren. I loved my work as a nurse. It gave me purpose and independence and a sense of contributing to something important. But Patricia never missed an opportunity to suggest that it was beneath me now that I was married to Marcus, that I should be focusing on supporting my husband's career and preparing for the children we would hopefully have soon. She made comments about my working hours, implying that I wasn't available enough for Marcus, that I was putting my career ahead of my marriage. She criticized our modest lifestyle, the fact that we cooked at home instead of dining at expensive restaurants, that we drove reasonable cars instead of luxury vehicles, that we spent weekends hiking or going to museums instead of attending the social events she thought we should be seen at. Every phone call, every family dinner, every interaction left me feeling drained and defensive, constantly having to justify our choices and our life together. Marcus tried to shield me from the worst of it, but I could see the toll it was taking on him, too. The way his shoulders tensed whenever his phone rang with his mother's ringtone, the way he sighed before calling her back, the careful way he worded things to avoid triggering another lecture or guilt trip. Then came the incident with money that would eventually lead us all to that courtroom, though at the time I had no idea how serious things were about to become. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I thought. Marcus's grandmother, a sweet woman named Eleanor who had always been kind to me despite her daughter's coldness, had passed away after a brief illness. I had visited her several times in the hospital during her final weeks, bringing her flowers and reading to her when she was too weak to hold a book herself, just sitting with her and holding her hand when she couldn't speak anymore. Eleanor had told me stories about her own marriage, about coming from humble beginnings and marrying into a wealthy family, about the challenges she faced from her in-laws, and I felt a connection to her that I hadn't felt with anyone else in Marcus's family. On one of those visits, just a few days before she passed, Eleanor had taken my hand and pressed something into it, closing my fingers around it and whispering that I should keep it safe, that it was for me, that I had shown her more kindness in her final days than her own daughter had shown in years. When I looked, I saw it was a beautiful antique brooch, gold with small diamonds, clearly valuable but also deeply sentimental. I tried to refuse, telling her it should stay in the family, but she insisted, squeezing my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail, making me promise to keep it and wear it sometimes and think of her. I was crying as I promised, knowing we didn't have much time left together, and that moment felt sacred, a gift not just of jewelry but of acceptance and love from someone who had truly seen me for who I was. After Eleanor's funeral, which was a large, formal affair that felt more like a society event than a memorial for a beloved grandmother, Patricia called a family meeting to discuss Eleanor's estate. I was surprised to be included since I assumed this was family business, but Marcus insisted I come, squeezing my hand reassuringly as we sat in the formal living room of his parents' house. Richard stood at the front of the room like he was presiding over a board meeting, discussing the distribution of Eleanor's assets, her properties, her investments, her personal belongings. Most of it was being divided between Patricia and her brother, with smaller trusts set up for the grandchildren, including Marcus and Caroline. Then Patricia brought up Eleanor's jewelry collection, particularly several valuable antique pieces that had been in the family for generations. She had apparently gone through Eleanor's jewelry box and was disturbed to find that the diamond brooch, one of the most valuable pieces, was missing. She looked directly at me as she said this, her eyes cold and accusatory, though she didn't directly voice what she was clearly thinking. Marcus immediately tensed beside me, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized where this was going. I spoke up, my voice shaking slightly, explaining that Eleanor had given me the brooch during one of my hospital visits, that it was a gift, that she had insisted I keep it. The room fell silent, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me, judging, calculating, disbelieving. Patricia's expression hardened, and she said in a voice dripping with false sweetness that surely I must be mistaken, that Eleanor wasn't in her right mind in those final days, that she couldn't have meant to give away such a valuable family heirloom to someone who had only been in the family for such a short time, that the proper thing to do would be to return it so it could be kept in the family where it belonged. I felt like I had been slapped, the implication clear that I wasn't really family, that I was an outsider who had somehow manipulated a dying woman into giving me valuable jewelry. Marcus defended me immediately, his voice tight with anger, saying that his grandmother was perfectly lucid until the very end, that if she chose to give the brooch to his wife, it was her right to do so, that I had spent more time with her in those final weeks than anyone else in the family had. The argument that followed was ugly, with Patricia crying about how disrespectful it was to question a dying woman's judgment, how the brooch had belonged to her own grandmother and should stay in the direct family line, how she couldn't believe Marcus was taking my side over his own mother's feelings. Richard suggested that perhaps a compromise could be reached, that maybe I could wear the brooch at family events, but it would officially remain part of the estate. But I refused, my voice stronger now, saying that Eleanor had given it to me as a gift, person to person, woman to woman, and I was not going to dishonor her wishes or treat her final gift to me as something I had to negotiate for or justify keeping. The meeting ended badly, with Patricia in tears, Richard looking at me like I was a thief, Caroline avoiding eye contact, and Marcus and I leaving without saying goodbye. Driving home in tense silence, both of us shaken by how quickly things had escalated, both of us trying to process what had just happened and what it meant for our future with his family. Over the next several months, things went from bad to worse in ways I never could have anticipated, and looking back, I can see how Patricia was building a case against me, though I was too naive at the time to recognize the signs. She started making comments about money whenever we saw her, remarking on expensive purchases Marcus and I made, questioning whether we could really afford our lifestyle, wondering aloud how we managed our finances. She would ask pointed questions about my salary, about my student loans, about whether I had any credit card debt, always framed as concern but feeling more like an interrogation. She suggested to Marcus that perhaps I wasn't being entirely honest with him about my financial situation before we married, that maybe he should look more carefully at our joint accounts and spending patterns. When Marcus told me about these conversations, I was hurt and angry, feeling like she was trying to paint me as some kind of gold digger or financial burden, when in reality, I contributed equally to our household expenses and was actually quite careful with money, having grown up in a middle-class family where budgeting and saving were important values. Then Patricia started telling family and friends that she was worried about Marcus's finances, that she suspected I was taking advantage of him, that she had noticed valuable items missing from family gatherings, always stopping just short of directly accusing me but making sure the implications were clear to everyone who would listen. I started noticing the way some family friends looked at me at events, whispered when I walked by, stopped talking when I approached, and I realized that Patricia was spreading rumors about me, poisoning people against me, building a narrative that I was untrustworthy, manipulative, perhaps even a thief. The situation reached a breaking point on what was supposed to be a celebratory occasion. Marcus had received a major promotion at work, completely on his own merit, and having nothing to do with the family company, and we were hosting a small dinner party at our apartment to celebrate with close friends and family. I had spent days preparing, cooking all of Marcus's favorite foods, decorating our small space to make it warm and welcoming, excited to share this achievement with the people we loved. My parents had flown in for the occasion, and it meant so much to me that they would be there to celebrate with us. Patricia and Richard arrived late, and from the moment they walked in, I could sense tension rolling off them in waves. Patricia barely acknowledged the food I had prepared, making a comment about how cramped our apartment was, and how difficult it must be to entertain properly in such a small space. Richard handed Marcus an envelope, which turned out to contain a check for a significant amount of money, telling Marcus that this was to help him and his wife get on better financial footing, perhaps move to a more appropriate home, live the kind of lifestyle that befitted their family name. I saw Marcus's jaw tighten, and he tried to politely refuse, explaining that we were doing fine financially and didn't need help. But Richard insisted, his voice taking on that commanding tone that brooked no argument, saying that clearly we did need help if we were still living in this tiny apartment and driving old cars, and apparently couldn't afford proper furnishings. My mother, bless her, spoke up then, pointing out that Marcus and I were both employed professionals who were living within our means and building our life together independently, and that perhaps Richard's money would be better spent elsewhere since we neither needed nor wanted it. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees, and Patricia's eyes flashed with something dangerous as she looked at my mother, then at me, then back at Marcus. What happened next still plays in my mind like a nightmare I can't wake up from, the moment when everything I had worked to build with Marcus's family came crashing down around me. Patricia stood up, her voice trembling with what seemed like genuine emotion, but which I now recognize as calculated manipulation, and said that she couldn't stay silent any longer, that she had tried to give me the benefit of the doubt, that she had tried to believe Marcus when he defended me, but she had evidence now, proof that I had been stealing from the family, taking money from Marcus's accounts without his knowledge, manipulating him and lying to him since the day we met. The room exploded into chaos, with my parents demanding to know what she was talking about, Marcus standing up and telling his mother she had crossed a line, Caroline looking shocked and confused, and Richard trying to calm everyone down while simultaneously suggesting that perhaps Patricia had a right to express her concerns. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in, like everything I had feared about never being accepted by this family was coming true in the worst possible way. Through the noise and accusations, Patricia pulled out a folder from her expensive handbag, laying out what she called evidence on our coffee table, bank statements with certain transactions highlighted, receipts she had apparently collected, documentation that she claimed proved I had been systematically stealing from Marcus, from the family, using my position as his wife to access money and valuables that weren't mine. I looked at Marcus, seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes, not because he believed his mother, but because he couldn't believe she would go this far, that she would make these accusations in front of everyone, that she would try to destroy his marriage and humiliate his wife in their own home. Have you ever been falsely accused of something terrible by someone you had tried so hard to please? Have you ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet as lies were presented as truth? Comment below if you've experienced this kind of betrayal, because what came next would test everything I thought I knew about justice and truth and fighting for your dignity. The dinner party ended in disaster, with Patricia and Richard leaving in a fury, my parents in shock and outrage, and Caroline apologizing quietly before following her parents out the door. Marcus and I sat in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration, surrounded by uneaten food and scattered papers filled with lies, and I cried harder than I had cried since my wedding day, but this time from pain and humiliation rather than joy. Marcus held me, apologizing over and over for his mother's behavior, promising me that he knew none of it was true, that he had complete faith in me, that he would fix this somehow. We spent hours that night going through every piece of evidence Patricia had presented, and what became clear was that she had taken legitimate transactions, things we had spent money on together or separately, and twisted them into something sinister through careful omission of context and creative interpretation. A check I had written to reimburse Marcus for my half of a vacation we took together became unexplained withdrawal from joint account. Money I had transferred between our accounts when balancing our household budget became suspicious transfer of funds. Purchases I had made with my own money were listed without noting they came from my account, not his. Even the brooch from Eleanor was listed as stolen family heirloom valued at $75,000. It was a masterclass in manipulation, taking fragments of truth and weaving them into a narrative of deception and theft, and what scared me most was how convincing it might look to someone who didn't know the full story, who didn't have access to all the information, who was predisposed to believe I was exactly what Patricia claimed I was. The next morning, Marcus called his parents, his voice steady but cold in a way I had never heard before, telling them that their accusations were completely unfounded, that every transaction they had questioned had a legitimate explanation, that they owed me an apology and needed to retract everything they had said. The phone conversation didn't go well. I could hear Patricia's raised voice through the phone even from across the room, could hear her crying and claiming she was only trying to protect her son, that she had proof I was manipulating him, that he was choosing a woman he had known for 3 years over the family who had loved him his entire life. Richard got on the phone and his voice was calmer, but somehow more threatening, telling Marcus that if he continued to defend me against these serious allegations, there would be consequences. That family loyalty meant something, that Marcus needed to think very carefully about whose side he was taking in this situation. Marcus's response was clear and unequivocal. He was on his wife's side, on the side of truth, and if his parents couldn't accept that, then maybe they needed some distance from each other until they could behave reasonably. He hung up, and I saw his hands shaking as he set the phone down, saw the pain in his eyes at having to stand against his own family, and I felt a crushing guilt that my presence in his life had created this rift, even though intellectually I knew this wasn't my fault, that Patricia had created this situation through her lies and manipulation. I thought the worst was over, that Patricia would eventually calm down and realize she had gone too far, that time and distance would heal these wounds. I was so wrong. 2 weeks after that disastrous dinner party, Marcus came home early from work looking pale and shaken, holding an envelope that he handed to me with trembling hands. Inside was a legal summons. Patricia and Richard were taking me to court, suing me for theft, fraud, and conversion of family assets. They were claiming damages in excess of $200,000, listing the brooch, various monetary withdrawals they claimed were unauthorized, and even some family silver that Patricia insisted had gone missing after I visited their home, though I had no memory of ever seeing the silver pieces she was talking about, and certainly had never taken them. The court date was set for 6 weeks away, and the case was filed in public court, meaning my name, the accusations against me, and the details of the case would be part of the public record, accessible to anyone who wanted to look, including my employer, my friends, everyone in Marcus's family's extensive social network. I felt physically sick reading through the legal complaint, seeing my character attacked in formal legal language, seeing my marriage and my life reduced to a list of alleged crimes and moral failings. Marcus immediately called his family attorney, only to discover that this was the attorney who had filed the case on his parents' behalf, a man who had known Marcus since childhood, and was now taking his parents' side against me. We scrambled to find our own lawyer, finally connecting with a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in family law and civil litigation, and when I sat in her office and told her the whole story, I could see both sympathy and concern in her eyes. Sarah was honest with me about what we were facing. Patricia and Richard had resources and connections that we didn't have. They had hired an expensive legal team, and they were clearly willing to spend whatever it took to win this case. More than that, the accusations they were making, even though false, would require us to prove a negative, to demonstrate that I hadn't taken things I had never taken, to explain away transactions that had perfectly innocent explanations, but could be made to look suspicious without context. She asked me detailed questions about every item they claimed I had stolen, about my relationship with Marcus's family, about any documentation I might have about Eleanor giving me the brooch, about bank statements and receipts and anything else that might help prove my innocence. I felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work ahead of us, by the cost of defending myself against these lies, by the reality that my name and reputation were being dragged through the mud in a very public way. Sarah filed our response to the lawsuit, denying all allegations and countersuing for malicious prosecution and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the war was officially on. The next 6 weeks were some of the hardest of my life, preparing for trial while trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, going to work and facing questions from colleagues who had heard about the lawsuit, attending depositions where Patricia's lawyers asked me invasive questions about every aspect of my life and finances, watching Marcus struggle with the reality that his parents were putting us through this, losing sleep and losing weight and feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The public nature of the lawsuit meant that rumors spread quickly through Marcus's family's social circle, and by extension, through much of the city's upper-class community. I would see people I vaguely recognized from family events staring at me in restaurants or at the grocery store, whispering to their companions, clearly having heard some version of the story. The hospital where I worked was mostly supportive, but I could sense some colleagues were uncomfortable, wondering if there was any truth to the allegations, keeping a bit more distance from me than before. My own family rallied around me completely, with my parents offering to help pay for legal fees, my siblings calling regularly to check on me and remind me that they knew I was innocent, my aunts and uncles sending cards and messages of support. But Marcus's extended family was a different story. Most of them sided with Patricia and Richard, either because they believed the accusations or because they didn't want to cross such powerful family members. Only Caroline stayed somewhat neutral, calling Marcus privately to say she didn't believe I was a thief, but that she couldn't openly go against their parents, that she was sorry but she had to think about her own position in the family. Even that lukewarm support felt like something in a sea of hostility and judgment. Marcus grew harder during those weeks, his natural optimism and warmth fading as he watched what his parents were doing to the woman he loved, to our marriage, to any hope of family reconciliation. We grew closer in some ways, united against a common enemy, but I also saw the toll it took on him, the way he would sometimes look at me with such sadness and guilt, as if he felt responsible for bringing me into this toxic family dynamic, as if he could have somehow protected me from this if only he had seen it coming or done things differently. As the court date approached, Sarah worked tirelessly to build our defense, going through every piece of evidence Patricia's lawyers had submitted and finding the flaws, the omissions, the deliberate misrepresentations. She gathered our own evidence, bank statements showing that transactions came from my accounts or were legitimate joint expenses, credit card receipts proving purchases were made with my own money, even statements from the hospital where Eleanor had died, confirming that I had been a regular visitor during her final days and that she had been mentally competent until very near the end. We had one major problem, though. We had no written documentation that Eleanor had given me the brooch, just my word against Patricia's claims that it was taken without permission. Sarah explained that in civil court, we didn't need to prove beyond reasonable doubt like in criminal cases, but we did need to show that it was more likely than not that my version was true, and without any witnesses to that hospital room moment when Eleanor pressed the brooch into my hand, it would come down to credibility, whose story the judge found more believable. I spent hours trying to remember every detail of that day, every word Eleanor had said, trying to find some way to prove what had happened, feeling the weight of knowing that this one piece of evidence, this one moment of kindness from a dying woman, had become the centerpiece of Patricia's case against me. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep, lying awake and going over everything in my mind, preparing for questions I might be asked, trying to steady my nerves and remind myself that the truth was on my side, that I had done nothing wrong, that justice would prevail. But I was terrified, absolutely terrified of standing in that courtroom and having to defend myself against lies, of seeing Patricia and Richard and knowing they hated me enough to do this, of the possibility that I might actually lose, that the judge might believe their version instead of mine, that my reputation and my future could be destroyed by people who were supposed to become my family. The morning of the trial, Marcus and I dressed carefully, both wearing conservative suits, wanting to project respectability and honesty. My hands shook as I put on the minimum makeup, and Marcus had to help me with my necklace because I couldn't manage the clasp. We drove to the courthouse in silence, both lost in our own thoughts, both scared of what the day would bring. When we arrived, there was already a crowd gathered outside. Not just Patricia and Richard with their legal team, but various family friends and society people who had apparently come to watch the spectacle, to see Marcus's wife put in her place, to witness what they probably assumed would be my humiliation and defeat. I saw the gleam of satisfaction in Patricia's eyes as we walked past, saw Richard's stern expression, saw their expensive lawyers with their leather briefcases and confident demeanors, and I felt so small, so outmatched, so terribly alone despite Marcus's hand firmly holding mine and Sarah walking confidently beside us. The courtroom itself was intimidating, all dark wood and formal seating, with the judge's bench raised above everyone else, a reminder of the power held over our lives in that space. We took our seats at the defendant's table, and I could feel eyes boring into my back, could hear whispered conversations, could sense the weight of judgment from people who had already decided I was guilty before hearing a single word of testimony. The judge entered, an older woman named Judge Morrison, who had a reputation for being fair but strict, and everyone rose. As we sat back down, Sarah squeezed my hand reassuringly, whispering that I should stay calm, answer questions honestly, and trust that the truth would come through. Patricia's lawyer began with his opening statement, painting a picture of me as a calculating woman who had targeted Marcus for his money, who had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into giving me valuable jewelry, who had systematically stolen from the family while pretending to be a loving wife and daughter-in-law. He spoke eloquently and confidently, and I watched the judge's face, trying to read her expression, terrified that she was believing every word. When Sarah stood to give our opening statement, she was equally compelling, describing me as a hard-working nurse who had fallen in love with Marcus not knowing or caring about his family's wealth, who had endured years of coldness and criticism from his parents, who had shown genuine kindness to a dying woman and received a heartfelt gift in return, and who was now being punished for refusing to submit to a controlling mother-in-law's demands. The trial proceeded with witness after witness, Patricia's side bringing family friends who testified to how valuable the brooch was, how it should have stayed in the family, how suspicious it was that it went missing. They brought the housekeeper who had been present at some family gatherings, though she admitted under cross-examination that she had never actually seen me take anything or behave inappropriately. They brought financial experts who analyzed our bank statements and pointed to transactions that they claimed were suspicious, though Sarah systematically dismantled each claim with documentation showing the legitimate purpose of every single transaction. When Patricia took the stand, she played the role of grieving daughter and concerned mother perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she talked about her mother's failing health, about the precious family heirloom that meant so much to their family history, about her growing concerns that I was taking advantage of Marcus financially and emotionally. She claimed that her mother would never have given away the brooch, that she had told Patricia specifically that it should go to Caroline after her death, that I must have taken it when Eleanor was too weak or confused to stop me. Under cross-examination, Sarah pressed her on why, if she was so concerned about Marcus's finances, she hadn't mentioned anything to him directly until after Eleanor's death. She questioned why Patricia had no evidence of these supposed conversations with Eleanor about the brooch. She brought up the fact that Patricia had barely visited her mother during those final weeks, while I had been there almost daily, a fact confirmed by hospital records. I watched Patricia's composure crack slightly, saw anger flash across her face, saw the judge taking notes and occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When it was my turn to testify, I was terrified but determined, placing my hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth, then sitting in that witness box feeling exposed and vulnerable. Sarah took me through my story gently, letting me describe how I met Marcus, how I tried so hard to build a relationship with his family, how Patricia had never accepted me, how Eleanor had been kind to me during her illness, how she had given me the brooch as a gift between two women who understood each other. I described that moment in detail, the weight of her hand in mine, the look in her eyes, the specific words she used, the way she made me promise to keep it and think of her. Patricia's lawyer was aggressive in his cross-examination, trying to trip me up, suggesting I was lying, implying I had ulterior motives. But I stayed calm, answered every question honestly, refused to be rattled even when he raised his voice or rephrased the same question multiple times, trying to get me to contradict myself. Then came the moment that everything had been building toward, the moment when truth would either triumph or be buried under lies and money and social power. Sarah stood and said she had one final piece of evidence to present, something we had only discovered 2 days before the trial, something that changed everything. She approached the bench and handed Judge Morrison a receipt, a simple piece of paper that looked insignificant, but carried the weight of absolute proof. The judge examined it carefully, her expression shifting from neutral to surprised to something that looked almost like satisfaction. She asked Sarah to explain the receipt's relevance, and Sarah did, her voice clear and strong in the silent courtroom. The receipt was from a jeweler in the city, dated 1 week before Eleanor passed away, showing that she had brought the brooch in to be cleaned and had specifically requested that it be packaged in a gift box with a card. The jeweler had kept the receipt and remembered the transaction because Eleanor had told him she was giving the brooch to someone special, someone who had shown her real kindness and love in her final days. Sarah had tracked down this jeweler after days of calling every jewelry store in the city, and he had not only provided the receipt but had agreed to testify if needed, confirming that Eleanor had been completely lucid and clear about her intentions, that she had smiled when talking about giving the brooch as a gift, that there was absolutely no question she knew what she was doing and wanted to do it. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and I saw Patricia's face go pale, saw Richard lean over to urgently whisper to their lawyer, saw the judge hold up her hand for silence. Judge Morrison looked at Patricia's lawyer and asked if he had any response to this evidence, and I watched him flounder, trying to argue that it didn't prove I was the intended recipient, that maybe Eleanor had changed her mind, that this didn't address the other allegations of theft and fraud. But the judge wasn't having it, pointing out that the other allegations had already been thoroughly debunked through bank records and receipts, that the entire case had hinged on the brooch and the claim that I had stolen it, and this receipt proved definitively that Eleanor had intended to give it as a gift. She asked Patricia directly if she had known about her mother taking the brooch to the jeweler, and Patricia hesitated, clearly trapped, before admitting quietly that she had not known, that her mother hadn't told her. Judge Morrison's expression hardened, and she began to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. She said she had sat through 2 days of testimony and reviewed extensive evidence, and it was abundantly clear to her that this case had no merit, that every allegation had been systematically disproven, that the receipt proved the central claim was false, and that bringing these charges appeared to be motivated not by genuine concern about theft, but by family conflict and a desire to control and punish the defendant for not submitting to the plaintiff's wishes. She said that filing false accusations in court was a serious matter, that it wasted judicial resources and caused immense harm to the accused, and that she was not only dismissing the case with prejudice, but was seriously considering sanctions against the plaintiffs and their legal team for bringing such a frivolous lawsuit. The relief that washed over me was so intense I thought I might faint, and Marcus grabbed my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse racing against my palm. But Judge Morrison wasn't done. She addressed Patricia and Richard directly, saying that it was clear they had used their resources and social position to try to bully and intimidate their daughter-in-law, that their behavior throughout this process had been vindictive and cruel, and that if this was how they treated family members who displeased them, she felt sorry for everyone in their lives who had to deal with such controlling and manipulative behavior. She said that the defendant, meaning me, had shown remarkable patience and dignity throughout this ordeal, that I had clearly tried to build a relationship with them despite their hostility, and that instead of appreciating the kind care I had shown to Eleanor during her final days, they had twisted it into something ugly and accused me of theft. She awarded us court costs and attorney's fees, a substantial amount that Patricia and Richard would have to pay, and she granted our countersuit for malicious prosecution, awarding us additional damages for the emotional distress and damage to my reputation that their false accusations had caused. As she brought down her gavel, officially ending the case, I started crying. Not pretty tears, but huge, gulping sobs of relief and vindication, and release of all the fear and stress I had been carrying for months. Sarah hugged me, Marcus held me, and I could hear the shocked murmurs from the gallery behind us. Could imagine the social fallout that was about to rain down on Patricia and Richard, who had so publicly and confidently tried to destroy me, only to have their lies exposed in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle. When we left the courtroom, I held my head high, walking past Patricia and Richard without looking at them, feeling Marcus steady and strong beside me, feeling like I had survived something terrible and come out stronger on the other side. The receipt that had saved me, that simple piece of paper from a jeweler who remembered a kind, elderly woman wanting to give a gift, had been the key to everything, the proof that couldn't be argued with or twisted or explained away. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had gotten wind of the high society family drama tried to ask questions, but Sarah handled them, making a brief statement about being pleased with the judge's ruling and hoping that my reputation could now be repaired after months of false accusations. My parents were waiting for us, having sat through every moment of the trial, and my mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, crying and telling me how proud she was, how she never doubted me for a second, how justice had been served. Marcus's face was a mix of relief and pain, glad that I had been vindicated but devastated by what his parents had tried to do, by the ugliness that had been revealed, by the reality that his family had chosen cruelty over acceptance, lies over truth, control over love. We went home that day exhausted but free, finally able to breathe without the weight of false accusations hanging over us, finally able to start rebuilding our lives without the shadow of the lawsuit darkening everything we did. The aftermath of the trial brought changes I hadn't anticipated, some good and some complicated. Patricia and Richard's reputation in their social circle took a serious hit, with many people who had witnessed the trial or heard about the judge's scathing remarks beginning to question the family's character and integrity. Some family friends reached out to Marcus privately, apologizing for believing the accusations, admitting they had been wrong to judge me without knowing the full story. Caroline called and apologized, saying she should have stood up for me, that she had been a coward to stay silent, that she hoped someday I might forgive her. Marcus's relationship with his parents was essentially destroyed, at least for the foreseeable future, and while I knew that caused him pain, he was also clear that he would never forget what they had tried to do to me, to us, and that any future reconciliation would require genuine apology and change on their part, neither of which seemed likely given their prideful natures. We decided to move forward with our lives, focusing on our marriage and our careers and building the family we wanted, without the toxic influence of people who had proven they would rather destroy us than accept us. I went back to work with my reputation intact, actually enhanced by the way I had handled the false accusations with dignity, and my colleagues were supportive and respectful, many saying they had never believed the charges anyway. Marcus threw himself into his work, excelling in ways that proved he didn't need his family's company or connections to be successful, making a name for himself independently of the family legacy. Looking back now, several months after that day in court, I realized that what Patricia and Richard tried to do to me, while devastating at the time, actually gave me something valuable. Absolute clarity about my own strength and about the kind of person I am. I know without any doubt that I can face terrible accusations, public humiliation, legal battles, and come through with my integrity intact. I know that Marcus loves me enough to stand with me even when it means standing against his own family. And that's not something every marriage could survive. I know that truth really can triumph over lies, though it sometimes takes a miracle, like a receipt from a jeweler who remembered a dying woman's kindness, to make that truth visible and undeniable. I wear Eleanor's brooch sometimes, and when I do, I think about the woman who gave it to me, who saw something in me that her own daughter couldn't or wouldn't see, who knew that her gift would be meaningful not just for its monetary value, but for what it represented about kindness and acceptance and chosen family over blood family. I think she would be proud of how I fought for that gift, for the truth of that moment between us, for my right to keep something given freely by someone who cared about me. The brooch is beautiful, but it's not about the diamonds or the gold. It's about being seen and valued by someone who understood what it meant to be the outsider marrying into a family that didn't want her, and choosing to give a gift that said, "You belong, you matter, you are worthy of beautiful things and love and acceptance." If you're going through something similar, if you're dealing with in-laws who don't accept you, if you've been falsely accused of something terrible, if you feel like you're fighting a battle where the other side has all the power and resources, I want you to know that truth matters, that staying strong matters, that refusing to be broken by lies and cruelty matters. It's not easy, and there were so many moments during that nightmare when I wanted to just give up, to return the brooch and apologize for things I didn't do just to make the attacks stop. But I'm so glad I didn't, because backing down in the face of lies only validates the lies and teaches bullies that their tactics work. Stand firm in your truth, document everything, keep records, find people who believe in you and support you, and trust that eventually, if you persist, the truth will come out. It might take a receipt from a jeweler. It might take a judge who sees through manipulation. It might take time and patience and more strength than you knew you had. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, if you don't let yourself be silenced or intimidated into giving up. Have you ever had to fight for your truth against people who seemed more powerful than you? Have you ever been vindicated after being falsely accused? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below because I think it's important for all of us to know we're not alone in these struggles, that other people have faced similar battles and survived and even thrived afterward. Understanding what you're worth, what you deserve, and what you will and won't accept in relationships is so crucial, whether we're talking about in-laws, partners, friends, or any other relationship in your life. Don't let anyone make you feel like you need to accept disrespect or cruelty or false accusations just to keep the peace or maintain relationships with people who clearly don't value you. You deserve better, and it's okay to fight for better, even when that fight is hard and scary and uncertain. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own relationships or struggles, please hit that like button below because it helps this story reach other people who might need to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences from real people navigating difficult family dynamics, relationship challenges, and life's unexpected plot twists, please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Every week, we share authentic narratives from people brave enough to tell their truth, and your subscription helps build a community where people feel less alone in their struggles and more empowered to face whatever challenges come their way. Thank you so much for listening to my story, for being here with me through every moment of this journey, and I'll see you in the next video. Remember, your truth matters. Your worth is not determined by whether other people recognize it, and sometimes the hardest battles lead to the strongest versions of ourselves. Take care and keep fighting for what's right.